You are now listening to a Patreon exclusive podcast. Hey guys, welcome back to my podcast series here on my Patreon. Now, last week I asked you guys what kind of case you would want to hear next, and most people said a missing persons case. The missing persons case won against an unsolved murder. It was pretty close, but missing persons case won. So today we're going to be discussing a case I've wanted to cover for so long. I just was a little hesitant because it has been covered quite a lot before, but there's a reason for that because it's just so odd. If you've never really dove into the case of the Sodder children, you're in for a crazy case. So with all that being said, let's just get into it. This story takes place near Fayetteville, West Virginia on Christmas Eve of 1945. This story revolves around the Sodder children, but let's discuss their father a little first. George Sodder was born in Sardinia, Italy in 1895. 13 years later, he and his older brother came to the United States, but his older brother went back home almost immediately after arriving. Many people have, of course, migrated to the United States, but it's a little unclear why George and his brother decided to, and why George wanted to stay so bad, in a place he really didn't know anybody. His past is a little fuzzy, and he never really talked about his life back in Italy. He worked on railroads in Pennsylvania, then as a driver in Smithers, West Virginia, and then he started his own trucking company that would haul dirt to construction sites and later haul in coal. He soon met a woman named Jenny, who was also an Italian immigrant who migrated during her childhood. They married and settled down right outside Fayetteville, West Virginia in a 2-story timber frame house. The area that they lived in, though, was primarily dominated by Italian immigrants, just like George and Jenny. George was quite respected in the area, but he did not keep his political opinions a secret. He strongly opposed the views of Italian dictator Mussolini. This would sometimes upset others in the community. Sometimes the conversations would end in intense arguments, but he stuck to his views. In 1923, George and Jenny welcomed the first of what would be 10 children. They were really living the American dream at this time. They owned a nice home, George's business was doing amazing, they were starting a family, and even though George had strong political views that differed from many in the community, they still became a well-liked family. They had the last of their 10 children in 1943, and by this time, their second oldest had enlisted in the military. World War II was going on during this time. Then, on April 28, 1945, Mussolini was executed, and this extremely affected the Italian community in West Virginia, and many couldn't get over the things George said about Mussolini while he was alive. About 7 months later, a visiting salesman had a few words to say with Mr. Sodder. He warned him that his home would go up in smoke and his children would be destroyed. He claimed his reasoning for saying this was because of George's remarks about Mussolini. I'm not exactly sure what George said back to the salesman, but I'm sure it wasn't anything good due to how open George was about his thoughts. Not long after, they had another visitor to the home that came to check everything out and told George that the fuse boxes in the back of the home were sure to catch fire one day, probably very soon. This confused George because not long before, he had the home rewired when they put in an electric stove, and the electric company said everything was safe and good to go. Then things only got stranger because in the weeks before Christmas, an older son of his noticed a strange car parked along the main highway that went through the town, and the driver was apparently watching the younger Sodder children as they made their way home from school. Christmas Eve for the Sodder family was like most families' Christmas Eve. The Sodders' oldest daughter, Marion, was working at a dime store and came home that day after work to surprise her younger sisters, Martha, 12 years old, Jenny, 8 years old, and Betty, 5 years old, with some presents, and the younger children were so excited that later on that night they asked their mother if they could stay up just a little bit past their bedtimes. Their mother told them they were allowed to stay up until their oldest brothers, John, 23 years old, and George Jr., 16 years old, went to sleep. Most of the middle children and older children worked during the days on the farm, so no one stayed up too late. Everyone was pretty much tired after working during the day. The parents and all the children kind of went to bed at different times during the night, but everyone was pretty much asleep by the time midnight rolled around. Then around 12:30 a.m., something very strange happened. The home's telephone rang. Jenny, the mother, woke up and went downstairs to answer the phone, and when she answered it, it was a woman. A woman's voice she did not recognize, asking for someone she did not know. There was the sound of clinking glass in the background. Jenny told her she had the wrong number and hung up. Jenny later recalled the woman having a very strange laugh as well. Jenny didn't pay much mind to the phone call. It was Christmas Eve. People were out late, and probably the woman was simply at a gathering and trying to get a hold of a friend or family member and dialed the wrong number. Right after hanging up, she noticed that the lights in the room were still on and the curtains were not shut. This struck her as being more odd than the phone call because turning the lights off and closing the curtains was something the children always made sure to do before they headed to sleep after their parents have. Jenny Sodder closed the curtains, turned the lights off, made her way upstairs, and went to sleep. She was sleeping barely half an hour when she was awoken again, this time by the sound of something hitting the home's roof. It made a loud bang and then sounded as if the object rolled off the roof. Yes, it was loud and she didn't know what it could have been, but she figured they'd check it out in the morning, so she again went back to sleep. Then, about a half an hour later, all hell broke loose. Jenny was awoken again, but this time by something far more terrifying, the smell of smoke. She got up again and ran to see where the smoke was coming from, and she quickly realized it was coming from George's office, around the telephone box and fuse box. She hurried back to wake her husband. Then they were on a mission to help their children escape the home as well. Out of George, Jenny, and their 10 children, only George and Jenny and 4 of their 9 children, 17-year-old Marion, 2-year-old Sylvia, 23-year-old John, and 16-year-old George Jr. were able to escape the home. 14-year-old Maurice, 12-year-old Martha, 9-year-old Louis, 8-year-old Jenny, and 5-year-old Betty did not. The 5 children unable to get out of the home had bedrooms on the very top floor in the attic. The staircase was engulfed in flames, and no one was able to get to them from inside the house, so they all ran outside and called up to the windows on the top floor, trying to get the children's attention, but none of the children came to any of the windows. Their parents figured they were all probably cowering in fear, waiting for them to rescue them. George had to work very quickly to try to help his children on the top floor. He tried to grab the ladder he always had leaning against the side of the home. Ironically, it was nowhere to be found. His brain automatically went to the idea to use one of his 2 coal trucks to try to reach the top window. He hopped in the first truck, tried to get it to start, and it wouldn't. He quickly rushed over to the second one. It wouldn't start either. He couldn't even believe what was going on. His ladder was missing from a spot it was always in, and now his 2 trucks that worked perfectly the day before, now neither of them would start. He then tried to scoop water from the rain barrel to help put out some of the flames from the fire, but the water was completely frozen. There was nothing the frantic father could do at this point to save his children. Marion ran as fast as she could to the neighbor's home to call the Fayette Fire Department. She called and called, but there was no answer. Someone nearby in a local tavern saw the fire though and tried to call as well, but they had no luck either. They decided to drive to town, and eventually Fire Chief F.J. Morris was tracked down. The fire department at this time, because of the war, was low on workers and operated with a system called a phone system, which basically meant one firefighter would call another, and then that firefighter would call another, and so on and so forth. And eventually, however, many firefighters would show up to the fire to try to put it out. The actual fire department was only about 2 miles away from the Sodders' family home, and no firefighters showed up to the home until 8 a.m., 7 hours later. Chief Morris said the main reason they took so long was because he himself could not drive the fire truck, and took them hours to get a hold of someone who worked for the department who could. It only took the home about 45 minutes to burn to the ground, and George, Jenny, their children, who escaped, all figured the other 5 Sodder children had perished in the fire. It was Christmas Day, and the family stood there completely devastated. The firefighters eventually made it to the home, one of which was actually a brother of Jenny, the mother. They all looked through the ash and burnt wood left behind of what was once the family's home, in the hopes of finding the children's remains to give them a proper burial. But here's where the story gets even stranger. They could not find any bones. Chief Morris came to the conclusion that possibly the fire was hot enough to burn the bodies completely, but a usual house fire is around 1,000 to 1,100 degrees Fahrenheit, and a fire has to be around 1,400 to 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit to completely cremate a body. But we'll get to that more in a second. After 4 days, George and Jenny could not bear to look at all the remains of their home anymore, and George decided to bulldoze about 5 feet of dirt over the area. And his intentions were to plant a garden in the spot where his home once was, as a memorial for his children. So, a police inspector comes to the house and takes a look at everything. The local coroner convened an inquest, and it held that the fire was caused by faulty wiring and was a complete accident. Ironically, one of the jurors was the man who came to the Sodders' home and told them that the home would go up in smoke and the children would be destroyed because of George's anti-Mussolini remarks. On December 30th, 1945, the children's death certificates were issued. January 2nd, 1946, was the children's funeral. Even though no bodies were found, George and Jenny were too distraught to attend their own children's funeral. George and Jenny's sadness and grief soon turned to suspicion, though. Too many things about their children's death just did not add up. Too many things did not make any sense. They started questioning if it actually was an electrical problem at all. They remembered that in the early stages of the fire, their Christmas lights were still on. How would their Christmas lights still be working if the power should have gone out completely if it was an electrical fire? They also thought originally that the telephone line had been burned completely in the fire. It was actually cut. Someone had to have purposely climbed up a 14-foot pole to cut it. A man who had been seen stealing neighbors' block and tackles admitted to being the one who cut the line. He claimed he thought it was a power line he could steal. He was arrested for the crimes, but said he did not start the fire. Jenny said in 1968 that if he in fact cut the high voltage power lines, there's no way her or her husband and other children could have ever made it out of the fire. It would have been more intense of a fire than what occurred that frightful night. Then they later found their ladder, the one that was always left leaning beside their home, about 75 feet away in an embankment. How did it get there? Who put it there? Why was it in a place it was never put in before, right when they needed it the most? Also, in the remains of the fire, there were still many household appliances found and easily recognizable. How would an appliance be able to survive through a fire, but not bones? How would there be absolutely no remains of 5 human beings? Jenny called a local crematorium, and an employee there informed her that a body would have to burn for a much longer time and at a much hotter temperature for there to be no skeletal remains at all. Of course, also the vehicles not starting. How could that have even happened? George himself thought that possibly someone had tampered with the vehicles beforehand, and maybe it was the man who had cut the power lines. In current times, though, some people, even remaining family members, think that possibly since George and his sons were in such a hurry to get the vehicle started, maybe they simply flooded the engines. However, that weird phone call, Jenny thought maybe that the woman had something to do with the fire. Maybe it was some sort of sick joke to call the home before starting the fire. While the woman was eventually tracked down, and apparently it was just a wrong number she called. Within time, the cold winter had ended and spring began, and the family stuck to their word of creating a garden over where the home once was. Jenny tended to the garden for the rest of her life. As time went on, their suspicion increased even more. They not only dove more into other ways the fire could have been started, but also started thinking that maybe, just maybe, their 5 children are actually still alive somewhere. A bus driver told the Sodders that on Christmas Eve he was driving through Fayetteville and saw people throwing what looked like balls of fire at the home. This was spring, which means all the snow had officially melted, and while walking around where the home once stood, little Sylvia picked up a small, dark green, rubber-like object that George said resembled a pineapple bomb, hand grenade, or some other type of explosive used in combat. George showed his wife, and they both also thought about how Jenny had heard that loud thump on the roof, and not long after the fire had started, on the roof instead, but there was no way for them to prove that. It only gets stranger from here. With the passing of time, supposed sightings of the children occurred. There was one woman who claimed that while the fire was happening, she saw a car pass by that contained passengers that looked just like the children. About 50 miles west, at a tourist shop, a woman said she served the children breakfast and they were with other adults. She also said there was a car in the parking lot with a Florida license plate, which was very strange because they rarely had people from Florida coming through. A woman in a hotel saw the children's photos in a newspaper and claimed they had came into her hotel. That would have been about 4 to 5 weeks after the fire occurred, somewhere in late January or early February. She said she did not remember the exact date, but the children were with 2 other men and 2 other women, and the men and women looked Italian if she had to guess. She said the entire party did not register at the hotel and stayed in a large room with several beds. They registered about midnight. I tried to talk to the children in a friendly manner, but the men appeared hostile and refused to allow me to talk to these children. One of the men looked at me in a hostile manner. He turned around and began talking rapidly in Italian. Immediately, the whole party stopped talking to me. I sensed that I was being frozen out, and so I said nothing more. They left early the next morning. Less than 2 years after the incident, George and Jenny sent a letter to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and actually received a letter back from J. Edgar Hoover. It said, "Although I would like to be of service, the matter related appears to be of local character and does not come within the investigative jurisdiction of this bureau." Hoover's agents said they would assist if they could get permission from the local authorities, but the Fayetteville Police and Fire Departments declined the offer. George and Jenny did the only thing they had left to do at this point. They hired a private investigator. His name was C.C. Tinsley. He found out quite a bit of interesting information, but most of all, he told them that apparently Morris confessed to a local minister that he had found a heart while searching through the remains of the home, and he kept it a secret from the family. They confronted him about this, and he claimed he did and that he buried it. They dug up the supposed heart, brought it to a funeral director, and it wasn't a heart at all. It was a beef liver, and it had never even been exposed to any fire. I couldn't find any information on what exactly George, Jenny, and the private investigators' reaction to this was, but I'm sure it was something along the lines of, what the hell? This part is probably one of the most confusing parts of this entire case to me. Apparently, he did this in the hopes that the word would get back to the family and they would decide this was proof enough that their children were dead and that they'd stop the investigation altogether. In 1949, George saw a photo of young ballet dancers in New York, and he claimed one of the girls looked exactly like his daughter Betty, so much that he actually drove all the way to New York. He tracked down where the girl attended school and asked to see the child in person to see if it was actually Betty, but they refused. In August of that same year, George got in contact with Oscar Hunter, a Washington, D.C. pathologist. He convinced him to excavate the area where the home once was, to supervise a new search through the dirt that remains. They found a dictionary that belonged to one of the children, some coins, and bones. Yes, this time they found bone fragments, and they were sent over to Marshall T. Newman, a specialist at the Smithsonian Institution. The bone was determined to be lumbar vertebrae, all from the same individual. The report said the human bones consist of 4 lumbar vertebrae belonging to one individual. The report said the human bones consist of 4 lumbar vertebrae belonging to one individual. Since the transverse recesses are fused, the age of this individual at death should have been 16 or 17 years. The top limit of age would be about 22, since the centra, which normally fuse at 23, are still unfused. On this basis, the bones show greater skeletal maturation that one would expect for a 14-year-old boy, the oldest missing Sodder child. It is, however, possible, although not probable, for a boy 14 and a half years old to show 16 to 17 maturation. So you're probably thinking there's a slight possibility it could be Maurice's because he was 14 at the time. Well, it wasn't, and it was impossible to be any of the Sodder children's or anyone else in the fires because the bone fragment had never been exposed to intense heat. So they all figured the bone had most likely come from the dirt when they bulldozed the area, that it was already previously in the ground. The Sodders were told by many people higher up that the case was completely hopeless. The FBI initially thought there was enough evidence where it may have been a kidnapping case, but they dropped it after 2 years of following leads that went absolutely nowhere. Everyone else gave up, but George and Jenny never did. They refused because they wholeheartedly believed their 5 children did not die in the fire that day. For years and years, they put up flyers, they put information on billboards. The billboards showed the photos of their children and read, "On Christmas Eve, 1945, our home was set afire and 5 of our children, ages 5 through 14, were kidnapped." The officials blamed defective wiring, although lights were still burning after fire started. The official report stated that the children died in the fire. However, no bones were found in the residue, and there was no smell of burning flesh during or after the fire. What was the motive of the law officers involved? What did they all gain by making us suffer all these years of injustice? Why did they lie and make us accept those lies? They even had a reward to anyone who could give them information that would lead to the discovery of what happened to even one of their children. The reward was originally set at $5,000 and then doubled to $10,000. The supposed sightings of them increased throughout the years, and George would travel to these different areas in an attempt to track down his children, but nothing ever came of it. One woman in 1967 sent a letter to the Sodders saying that one night after too many alcoholic beverages, a man confided in her that he was Louis Sodder, and she believed that Louis and Maurice were living somewhere in Texas together. George and his son-in-law, Grover Paxton, traveled to the area but were unable to speak to the woman. They were able to track down the two men she was referring to, and they insisted they were not Louis and Maurice. Once again, they hit a dead end. Grover said years after George had passed away that George always wondered if the two boys were actually his sons. Then they received another letter, one that was a bit more interesting. Jenny found a letter sitting in her mailbox one day, postmarked from Central City, Kentucky, but it had no return address. It contained a photograph of a young man. This young man claimed he was Louis Sodder. On the back of the photograph, it contained a strange message. It said, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, ILIL, boys, A90132 or 35. The cryptic message didn't make much sense, especially because Louis never even had a brother named Frankie. Nonetheless, they decided to hire another private investigator and send him to Kentucky. They never heard back from him, though. This photo, though, gave them more hope, even adding the photo to the billboard. About a year later, George said in an interview, "It's like hitting a rock wall. We can't go any further. But we only want to know. If they did die in the fire, we want to be convinced. Otherwise, we want to know what happened to them." George and Jenny never got to, though. John was the only one out of his siblings who believed his parents and everyone else just needed to move on. George, Jenny, and everyone else just wanted proof. They wanted answers. George passed away in 1969. After he did, Jenny stayed in their home. She wore black almost every day to mourn the loss of their children, and she continued to tend to the garden until she herself died in 1989. After she did, their children decided to finally take down the billboard. They still continued in the search, though, still making sure the story didn't die. As of 2015, the only living Sodder child was the youngest, Sylvia. She said since she was the youngest, she was of course the last one to leave home and move out on her own. She said most nights her and her father would stay up talking and coming up with theory after theory of what may have happened to the other children. One thing that I do have to mention is that when John Sodder was originally questioned by authorities about what happened that night, he told them that he ran upstairs and tried to wake his siblings up, but they weren't waking up, so he fled the home to save his own life. Then he later completely changed his story and said he never saw his siblings, that he only called up to them and then left the home. A local author named George Bragg wrote about the case in his 2012 book titled West Virginia's Unsolved Murders. In this book, he claims John was telling the truth in his original story and that he did in fact see the children before fleeing the home and that the children did die in the fire. Possibly he changed his story out of guilt because he didn't try harder to wake them up or get them out of the home. Maybe that's also why he was the only child who thought everyone in his family should just move on from what happened. George Bragg, though, says this was just a theory and ends it by saying, "Logic tells you they probably did burn up in the fire, but you can't always go by logic." You're probably wondering, though, why would these 5 children survive the fire and never decide to contact their family members ever again? Why would they be kidnapped and live out their lives elsewhere, leaving their lives behind, leaving their loved ones in the dark to worry for the rest of their lives? Well, there is a popular theory in this case that perhaps the Sicilian mafia was trying to extort money from George Sodder, that possibly someone knew about this plan, maybe someone on the inside, and decided to make their way into the home and take the 5 children to save them, that maybe they were taken back to Italy or taken somewhere else in the country and never reached out to their family to try to protect them. This theory is a little out there. It's not impossible, but there are a few things that don't make sense. 1, wouldn't you think maybe one of the 5 children would eventually want to reach out to their loved ones, even as their parents and siblings were nearing their deaths? Since the youngest child, Sylvia, is the only one possibly alive in today's time, all 5 who are missing would mostly be dead by now. Don't you think during their entire lives, one of them would have contacted someone? Also, how would someone have been able to come into their home and take not only 1, but 5 children and no one hear anything? How could all the children not make a sound when leaving the home? How would not even one child scream for help? One person on Reddit said that maybe the person claimed to be with the fire department and tried to get them out. But still, how would all this go on without anyone hearing anything? The only thing I could think of is that maybe they went with the person voluntarily because it was someone they knew. There wasn't anything I could find online though for possibly who that could be. But let's say they did make it out. Say they were taken by someone in the Sicilian mafia, like many people, including their own family members, believed. If you do believe this theory, then maybe you're going to find this next bit of information interesting. Remember those things written on the back of the supposed photo of Louis? Well, the numbers either 90132 or 90135 are area codes in Palermo, which is the capital of Sicily. Ironically though, this letter with this photo came not long after an article about the case was published in a magazine, so chances are it may have been a complete hoax. There was also a theory that maybe members of George's own family came over to the United States to abduct the children, bring them back to Italy, and let them live out there and start a new life. But why would George's own family set fire, though, to their home that could have possibly killed the rest of their family, including George and Jenny? Even though a large portion of people believe that there's something extremely strange about the entire case, that maybe it is as simple as the 5 children perished in the fire and their remains were never found because the investigation was done wrong, which isn't too odd for an investigation, especially one during the mid-1940s, this fire department couldn't even make it to the home before the fire was completely out. It took them several hours to just show up. It could be likely they didn't properly examine the situation. They really only went over the area for 2 hours before stating that there was no remains anywhere. Then a few days later, George bulldozed the area to make a memorial. He was a grief-stricken parent that believed there were no remains there, but maybe there should have been another search done after the first one just to make sure. One theory many have dove into online on message boards is that there is a chance that coal had something to do with it. George did transport coal, and he had a large amount of it in his home to help heat it during the winters. Coal does make a fire hotter and burn for a longer period of time. Maybe it reached a temperature that would have cremated all the bodies. This still doesn't explain how so many of their belongings in the home were still recognizable though. What if their remains were still there at some point? You can't always trust what people say, but apparently 4 people who were interviewed on the day of Christmas who helped in the search said they definitely saw human remains but didn't say anything. Some online sleuths discussed it and talked about how maybe Morris took the remains and never told the family. This again wouldn't explain why he later faked a beef liver as being one of the children's hearts to get the family to stop an investigation. Why wouldn't he just come forward with the bones? No matter what, there were no sounds heard from upstairs, and if the children were up there, what if they were already dead? What if they died by smoke inhalation and that's why they didn't scream for help or make their way to the window when George tried to save their lives? If the fire was not caused by faulty wiring, maybe it was caused by the strange dark green rubber-looking grenade found in the yard. Maybe it was one of the people the bus driver saw throwing fiery objects at the home. Maybe they did it because of George's political views. Most everyone who researches into the case, though, no matter what their opinion of what happened to the children, mostly agree that the fire itself was most likely arson. There's too many clues that make it look like it was done on purpose. This is just one of those cases that leaves you with a million questions and pretty much no answers. It can go in 1,000 different directions, and everyone seems to have a different opinion. No matter what, it is a tragedy. A tragedy that has resulted in thousands of individuals for the past 73 years making their way down the rabbit hole that is the case of the Sodder children. This is where we end today's podcast with a question for all my patrons. What do you think happened to the Sodder children during the early morning of Christmas of 1945?